Welcome back to Lead Wisely by WonderTour. We are going to talk about another tough question about leadership by examining the movie Interstellar by Christopher Nolan. So what does Interstellar show us about how humans should behave in the presence of huge intractable outside forces? If you're a leader and you've got something happening in your environment that you don't have control over that's going to influence you, how do you approach that challenge? How do you think about it? And so in this movie, the challenges that we're presented with are the biggest ones you can imagine, right? The intractable forces of gravity and time, which are maybe implied to be the same thing somewhere under the hood. Let's go into this, Drew. So tell us about a scene in this movie where we're grappling with this challenge of external forces that we maybe don't have control over, but they're obviously controlling us.
Okay, so in Interstellar, you get this mirror across the movie. You have right at the middle of the mirror is what we talked about in WonderTour episode 1. So you have them coming back off of Miller's planet, and the perspective shifts from Cooper to Murph. So if you look back at the movie, you'll see that there are images, there are scenes that are mirrored on opposite sides of the movie from that point. And so I think what we want to talk about here is, like we teased, gravity and time. So the scene that we're looking at here that's mirrored is the first interaction early on with time and gravity, where you have Murph being like, "Dad, there's a ghost." And Cooper, this scientist engineer, is like, "No, there's no ghost. Murph, there's no ghost." And then slowly coming to the realization, like, there's something to this, and this weird intractable force of gravity that we thought we didn't understand and that, was consistent is acting inconsistently. And then you get the flip side, parallel version of that at the end when you have Murph setting the farm on fire and finally going back into the house that she's been unwilling to go back into basically for the entire movie. She says she can't bear to go back into it. Finally, she's like, I have to go back to that spot. Why? Because gravity, the equation that she and Dr. Brand had been trying to solve, that she had believed up until a point was solvable, Brand has that dying moment with her where he tells her, I solved that equation a long time ago. I was lying to you to try to keep the mission going. I was lying to try to keep humanity going. At which point she basically realizes we have to do something new. So to me, it's how does she respond to this weird phenomena that's happening with Murph's ghost versus how does Cooper respond and how does Dr. Brand respond to those sort of, it's almost supernatural, but what Interstellar tries to cast it as, like you said, Brian, is natural, but hard to understand.
Right. Yeah, so let's take a moment to just sympathize with the sort of the leadership situation that Murph finds herself in, right? So she spent her career becoming a scientist and studying this huge intractable problem of how do we invert gravity so we can lift all the humans off the planet and save the species, right? And she's just been saddled with the person that she trusted, the person that trained her, the person that she's been working with for her whole adult life is like, oh yeah, this was all BS. Like, this was never going to work. I figured that out a long time ago. This was just a charade to distract us while we're going to go solve the real problem with the other half of the movie. And that emotional weight of like, this is all pointless and it can't possibly be solved because it's just too intractable. Like, there's nothing that can be done about it, right? Many of us would respond to that quite appropriately with despair. Like, this stinks. I'm going to go have a drink somewhere and not worry about it anymore. Right? I'm done. I'm giving up. Right? That would be, and like we talked about in the first episode, they've still got the giant wave, bearing down on them. They still have the human extinction, the planet falling apart, where this is, we're all doomed. They still have that bearing down on her. And so Murph being one of our archetype leaders in this movie, right? She doesn't respond that way. She doesn't respond, well, rats, I guess we're doomed. She responds, there's still a thing in the world that doesn't make sense to me, right? There's an unexplained little corner over here that doesn't work with our understanding of the world. And maybe there's something there, right? If the stuff that I do understand says it's impossible, then I'm going to go play with the thing that I don't understand. I'm going to open myself up to the possibility that there's some nuance in the world that I don't get. in the movie we're shown, gravity and time as these two as the intractable forces, but the emotional content of like, I'm going to be open to the solution is a thing that we see from her that I think we can aspire to. That is very recognizable. Like, well, maybe my understanding of the universe is imperfect, and we're not actually doomed.
Yeah, I think that's really good to just because you can see a constraint, just because you maybe have experienced a constraint, not to let it take too deep seated a hold on you, because that seems to be what happens to Dr. Brand, right? He has solved the gravity equation and he can't rectify it with relativity. And so he just freezes up and moves to plan B. That's his
Right.
response. He's
Right.
like, nope, there's no impacting this force. It's too big for me to touch it. But what we see Murph and Cooper do is take a non-obvious path to a solution. They start looking for the things that don't make sense. They keep stoking their curiosity. They understand that they might not have control of this, that who knows how Cooper got the coordinates of NASA, right? At that point in the movie, he has no idea. How does Murph as a child understand that she has a ghost? She doesn't understand. But she does come back to that again and say, that didn't make sense to me. It's not that maybe I'll ever understand it, but I'm not going to give up on it just because it didn't make sense to me. And I think there's things that we experience in our lives potentially that don't necessarily make sense to us. That, you experience something that you felt shouldn't have happened the way that it happened, and it leaves an impact on you, but maybe you don't understand it. You experience something that felt, too tough, too much like it was just like, why did this happen to me? The universe did this to me or whatever, but how do I progress from here? And as we've talked about on WonderTour in the past, Murph goes back to the house, which is generally what you have to do in order to move past these huge moments internally. But the external thing that happens with the intractable force is she recognizes that maybe there's some consistency to it. Maybe the anomaly is actually what underlies reality in the end.
Right.
And maybe the rest of things could perhaps be the anomaly.
Right. And it also, we have the emotional lesson of she has to go face the painful thing, right? She's had to swallow the idea that her father's probably actually gone and wasn't ever intending to come back, right? And she's got to go back to the house and go look at his watch. So there's that emotional lesson, and we can contrast this. This is good. This will get us to our mountaintop moment, right? Is that we can contrast that with how other characters in the movie behave in the face of this possible, likely despair, right? So the Dr. Brand, the mentor character, he responds to despair by like, I'm just not going to tell anybody about it, right? We're gonna do our best this one way. That we're just not going to tell everybody else that that's what's happening, right? We're gonna have the charade. Murph responds to it by digging deeper into science, which is her thing, and facing her anxiety. And then we have Dr. Mann. We have the best of us, the greatest of the explorer, the leader of the program, the guy who put everything together, the greatest mind of the century, who is, of course, played by Matt Damon. He's out on some far-flung planet. So what do we see from him in the face of this intractable forces, in the face of despair?
Yeah, Dr. Mann takes and this is something that we see in this movie. We see these contrasted versions of similar stories. And this is where we can talk about technology. This is where we can talk about how you approach something determines the types of solutions that can come out of it. The same type of inputs can result in different outputs depending on how we approach it, essentially. So Dr. Mann sees this intractable force. He tells them that. He's like, yeah, I knew all along that he'd already solved the gravity equation and that plan B was the only plan. But eventually that mindset that Dr. Brand kind of instills in him of just be quiet and do what we have to do. You'll be the bad guy. It's fine, but we'll keep humans going. I'm willing to take the moral plunge so that humans can keep going. That mindset seems to almost take hold in Mann and evolve to the point where Mann has become so prideful. Stop me if you've heard Mann becomes prideful before. And can't let his own life go. He has inextricably tied himself to the future of humanity instead of being able to separate himself from the future of humanity, which is what Cooper and Murph do.
Right. Yeah, and so we see So Cooper has already had to make the one sacrifice, right? He already had to leave his daughter behind. He already had to leave his family behind to be able to go do this thing, right? So he's already investing in the future of humanity at some personal expense. And then we see, yeah, the Dr. Mann character calls them to his barren planet, even though there's no way that they could possibly, colonize it. Just because he wants to talk to some humans and get off the planet, right? He's incredibly lonely and incredibly selfish. So that's his first moment of kind of his character sort of comes to the surface, and we have a hand to hand combat on the barren planet. And he takes off and tries to get back to their ship so that he can save at least himself and go do the mission himself. Right? He's still paying lip service to the bigger mission, but he's not willing to give up his own aspirations. And so then we get this again wonderfully symmetrical series of scenes about how the Dr. Mann character tries to solve his problem, and then how Cooper is forced to survive the aftermath. So talk us through this, Drew, because I know this is something I think we kind of gets to the real heart of several of the elements we've been talked about in this movie.
All right, so this is winding our way up to the mountaintop. We like to talk about going on a wonder tour as a journey. We're going on a journey. We're going on a hike. Maybe we've been on this hike before, but we're going to find something new. Maybe this is a new hike for us. Maybe we're going on this hike with new friends. More to come on that in the future. But when we go on these hikes, there's always something to see on the hike. And for us, it's the mountaintop. And for me, the mountaintop in all of Interstellar is the docking procedure scene with Dr. Mann, followed by Cooper's docking procedure scene. So if you're an old WonderTour fan, you'll know that we've talked about this scene before in an episode about Interstellar in our Curious Explorers series in our audio only format. But we bring it up in a different light here. So this scene where Dr. Mann is essentially in his hubris, trying to escape, trying to manually do a thing that he should not be able to do, which is dock his lander with this overall spaceship. It's a thing that we see at the beginning of the movie. Again, these paralleled moments. We see Doyle sweating as he's trying to perform the docking procedure there. So we know it's a hard thing to do, obviously, because if you don't get it perfectly right, if there's any expanse in between the two materials, you're going to create you're going to explode it or whatever, right? I'm not an astrophysicist, so. But he goes in there and they're trying to tell him over the comms, man, don't do this. If you fail, you're going to doom humanity. And Mann, in his hubris, turns off the audio and just keeps going and just keeps thinking no, I'm the guy who's going to save it. I always was the guy who was going to save us. That's why they came to save me. He has this himself at the center of the universe mindset that is always the problem for humans. And what does he do? He blows out the whole side of the ship, basically. And the ship goes careening off towards the planet. I mean, Brian, this is a total devastating moment. You've made it through so much. If you're Cooper and Amelia at this point, you just lose Rom down on the planet. You're chasing Mann, who you thought had this suitable planet for you, and then he blows up part of the spaceship.
So he's totally betrayed them, and so now they are in this debris field, and their one link to both succeeding as a mission and personally surviving is falling into the planet, and they have not a lot of options, right? So again, we see Cooper go into okay, well, there's only one possible thing to do mode, so we're going to go do the thing, right? And so they have this very dramatic cinematic sequence where they're adjusting the spin of their spaceship to match the spin of the other spaceship, and then trying to dock it in the middle of all this chaos so that they can then pull it out in time. But we see a couple of the elements we talked about, right? We've got this moment of decision. We've got this moment of, we're just going to have to go do the thing. And we've got also the Cooper giving up personal control, right? Not having the idea that he's going to be able to do it. He's got to trust the technology. He ends up using TARS to fly the ship. You're going to have to do it for us. I'll tell you what my goal is. You're going to do the super fast processing calculations to make it happen. So, and then we get Drew's favorite line, right, out of the whole sequence. What does TARS say? What's his complaint?
TARS is that's not possible. We can't do that.
Right.
And Cooper turns around and he's no, that's the only option.
It's
We are doing
necessary,
that.
right? Exactly. Yes. It may not be possible, but it's necessary. So we're doing it, right? So we've got the human machine leveraging, right? He's using machines for the things that they're good at. He's using, his own, like, this is the only possible path, so we're going to try it, even though it's a threading the needle situation. But we've also got, in classic cinematic style, we're being shown that they had a kind of a purity of purpose, right? Their intention is not for just themselves, right? Their intention all along has been trying to maximize the big picture, trying to make the humanity's survival as much as possible. Whereas you said, Dr. Mann was all centered around himself, like humanity should only survive if I get to do it, right? And that's clearly not one of the leadership lessons we want to talk about.
This is something that we've taken away from so many movies, Brian, is sacrifice is critical to growth for humans. And the thing that we sacrifice will determine the direction that we grow. If we're willing to sacrifice from our own, if we're willing to sacrifice things that we have to pay for emotionally or cognitively or physically, then generally the results can be positive on the world if it's done with the right approach. But if we choose to instead sacrifice things that are easier for us, like Mann sacrificing the other team members in order to be able to escape himself, then humans become the worst version of humanity. And we see the power struggles and the loss of freedom and equality and all of these things all start to ramp up, and it all happens very quickly. So I think one thing that we can take away from this mountaintop scene here, as we see the kind of docking scene failure and the inverted docking scene success, is that what we sacrifice will determine the direction of the result, essentially. We cannot be willing to sacrifice our character. That's the one thing that we say on WonderTour. Above all else, sacrificing our character basically ensures that in the long term, things will be worse for us and will be worse for the things around us. And sacrificing character is something that Dr. Mann has clearly made a habit of. And which is also, to me, seems like, and we could have a whole argument about Dr. Brand here, but the more I've watched this film, the more I have concerns with Dr. Brand's character. Because at first you're like, oh, he's well-intentioned. He hid it from them because it was the only way. You're like, but the more you think about it, you're like, did he really hide it from them because it was the only way? Or did he hide it from them because he had a fixed mindset and he thought that was the only way? Did he really give everyone else a fair shake? Or did he just grab for the controls just like Dr. Mann and say, I've got this one, you trust me?
Mm-hmm.
And how is that contrasted then, Brian, with what we see on the opposite side coming out of our mountaintop here with the Cooper, taking his rover into Gargantua?
Right. Yeah. So then the following scenes here, we see some, real long shot trial by Cooper, right? Just the same as Murph is sort of opening herself up to the possibility that the universe might have more going on than she understood, and that she's going to have to get through her own emotional hangups and her own kind of preconceived mindset to solve the problem. Cooper's got sort of the same thing where he has a sacrifice moment, and he has a exploring some new element of the universe that he was open to. But what I want to call it back to is kind of our original thesis here, right? About these intractable forces, about what do you do in the face of huge risks or huge things that you can't do anything about, and about how do you balance the emotion and the rationality of your response to that, right? Because we see you could argue that Dr. Brand's failure mode is he's too rational about it. Like, we're going to solve this problem with this sending the human eggs into space, and we're going to pretend to solve the problem with the equations, but that was never going to work. Like, I'm hyper rational. I just don't think it's going to work, so I'm not going to keep trying, right? Whereas Dr. Mann is too emotional about it when he gets over. I personally have to solve this problem. I have to have ownership of it. Characters that freeze in a situation or freak out in a situation, or who say, oh, anyway, we're just going to stay here and farm until we run out of food. Like, that's too far in the emotional direction. But this balance of, I use the emotion to motivate me. I use the emotion to clarify why I'm doing this. But then I use the rationality to navigate a path, however narrow it might be, right? I use the emotion to say it's necessary for us to survive, so we're going to try. And I use the rationality of, but I can't pilot the ship that precisely, so I'm going to have the robot do it, right? That's the blend that we're looking for, right? And Murph's emotional intelligence of like, I desperately want humanity to survive. I desperately want, my father to have meant something, right? I'm going to use that to motivate me, but then I'm going to sit here and I'm going to work out the Morse code. Like I'm going to sit here and stare at this problem until I've got another way that it can go. That's a really difficult balance to walk when you get presented with something. I think, and this will maybe a good time to bring in some practical applications. Like what are situations where you might feel like this, even past the giant wave situation. Now we're into the existential threat situation, or the all is lost, everything I've ever believed is bogus situation.
I think bringing in now like a business example is helpful here, because as we look at that balancing of rationality and emotions, I think you could also look at that because machines are wholly rational. You're not rational in terms of rational, like in cold dead truth, this is the way things are, but rational in terms of their inputs. They can only be rational based on their inputs. That's it. They're just purely logical. There's a model driving everything. So it can only be a form, the output can only be a redistributed form of the inputs in some way. As we then look at, though, humans have gut feel. Humans have the ability, like Cooper did in that moment, to say, chase down that ship right now, otherwise we're doomed. I don't care if you don't think there's a chance that we can catch it. Like, I have this underlying whatever love is that transcends time and space that is dragging me to complete this mission, that won't let me let this mission go, and it's pulling on my emotions in a positive, he's taking the stress in a positive way to pull him towards his objectives. Now, this is a movie, so obviously it's like really big and fantastic and stuff, but I think we can see this in an everyday situation with just the way that we interface with technology. There's a lot of leaders that see automation, that see data science, that see, new applications and services and all these different things as what we need to do, right? That is the what. As long as that is the what, though, what is the purpose of it? Again, going back to what we talked about in episode 1, how are we going to do it? So let's say in this example, you want to have a better way to run your business. So you want to have more control. You're going to start pulling all of this data from all of these different systems and inputs and maybe external data sources that tell you things about the environment and all these other things. And you're going to pull them all in and put them in some sort of a dashboard to give you a better way to run your business. So I think, Brian, you and I have both had experiences doing things like that before. And you can end up on the very rational side of that spectrum where you're like, I just want the machine to tell me what to do, and I'll just pull the trigger, basically. Just have the machine tell me what to do, have it process as much data as we have access to. And then the other side of that is like, maybe considered to be a more old school or gut feel mindset that's like, but I don't trust machines. Maybe I should just, maybe we should just whiteboard this up, or like, maybe, just have it give me this information I'm already getting, but I just want it automated now. And really, isn't the answer somewhere in the middle where there's still room for those emotions to influence the way that we respond to things, but we leverage machines to their best extent. We leverage rationality, like machines, as almost like a rationalizer in this situation, to be able to tell us, okay, well, TARS is telling me what the rational solution is. My brain is telling me what the emotional solution is. As the human who actually understands the purpose and mission, how do I find the line?
Right. And this is, in this movie, we see the decision making is inherently residing with the humans, right? We don't, TARS is AI to the extent that he can have a conversation with you and can solve problems really fast, but he's not AI in the sense that he's the captain and everybody else is doing his bidding, right? We're still putting humans in charge in this conception of it. And that's not, like you said, that's not necessarily the way all businesses are looking at it, but you can use technology in a couple ways, right? You can use like, oh, I'm hearing the voice from my team that says there's a problem. Let's get some data and find out if it's a real problem. Let's find out how big the problem is. Let's see if we can detect, does it look like another problem that we've had before, right? So that's, emotion triggered. Then let's add a rational layer and see if we can verify what's going on. Or if it's just like, oh, this actually looks like the last 6 times this happened, it's fine, right? There's the other way around, right? Which is there's way too much data that we could ever possibly digest. we should use the machine to sift through all that and find the outliers or find the things that look like they're about to get bad. And then we'll dispatch some humans to go look at it for real and do a much more nuanced and, fine-grained and intuitive understanding of it. And then we'll decide what those problems are to solve. Like those are both valid methods. But in the presence of a complicated world, in the presence of infinite amounts of data, in the presence of so much stuff happening, and it's hard to tell which things are which, like just doing it with just humans running around like brute force is maybe is not going to be your most effective technique, and just like do whatever the machine learning model tells you to do is also highly risky. Famously, the real estate company Zillow a couple years ago was involved. They had incredible amounts of data about real estate transactions, and they were able to make forecast models of what they thought houses were going to be worth. So they started this thing called Zillow Offers, where they were algorithmically identifying and making offers on houses, so that they could buy them and then flip them in 6 weeks. They were, we forecast this house is worth more money than it's currently asking for. Or we forecast that it will be worth more money in 3 months, and so we should jump on it, and then we'll turn around some money. And this worked really great for like 2 or 3 years until there was a global pandemic and a following recession and a complete, crippling of the real estate market. And hey, guess what? The machine learning model was not trained on something like that because they didn't have any data that looked like that. And they ended up with an $800 billion loss or $800 million loss in 1 quarter, and we're going to wind this business down, and we have 7,000 houses we're sitting on that we have to sell in a hurry, right? This was an inappropriate deployment of machine learning, not just for forecasting, but actually for real-time decision-making at a huge scale, without sort of appropriate evaluation of the risk, without appropriate evaluation of like, well, how much trouble could we possibly get in if we're wrong? So what was the purpose? The purpose there was make a bunch of money in the real estate market, but it was only valid in one set of conditions. And as we see in this movie, right, sometimes the conditions look terrible, or sometimes the conditions are outside of your experience, and you have to be able to navigate that. And we aren't at a point yet with machine learning where that's a thing that we know how to do.
Yeah, I mean, overall, AI and machines in general are constrained by what they have seen before. Specifically, when we're talking about like MLAI, it is constrained by its inputs. If you do not have a model for what happened during COVID in your Zillow offers model, it will not know how to respond to that situation. Similarly, when we look at how we talked about at the beginning, how Murph responded to a intractable force, and we can kind of weave all of this together a little bit. It's not going to be a nice tight package. It isn't usually like that on WonderTour, but you can see what Murph does. And again, Murph has the ability as a human who has this great sense of purpose to look past the previous inputs. The previous inputs, aka if we just were to totally simplify it down to Dr. Brand's equation, would suggest we cannot rectify what we know about gravity with relativity. If that's the case, plan B. She didn't take that for an answer, though, because she looked at it and she was able to look past it, and she said, but there's things I don't understand. I can still learn. I'm going to keep learning. I'm going to keep understanding. And that's where it's like, now, again, you have a use for machines. I have a thing I need to learn. Let's go work with machines to learn that thing. Let's see what they can teach me. Let's constantly validate if it actually applies to our purpose and if it's wise to implement it. And that's what we're going to get into here more. It's not all going to be just AI and machine learning, but that's what we're going to get into more in our future episodes here.
Yeah. All right, so let's get started on some key takeaways here, because as we've been talking through, I think we've got a couple of recurring themes, right? And we started with intractable, external forces, and we ended up with emotions and rationality inside our own little brains. But a couple things that I've been thinking about as we're talking, right? One is that, in the face of these, these massive, whatever it is, the wave of social change, or the wave of the COVID disruptions, or the wave of, economic upheaval, or gravity in time, and this movie's terminology, right? We talked about anchoring to purpose. We talked about anchoring to what is your purpose, and using emotion as a way to make sure that you're you're anchored to that human part of the purpose. But then we also talked about using that emotion as a motivator to get moving, using that emotion as a motivator to examine the world, But then in the face of these intractable forces, like, look for the anomalies. Look for the thing that doesn't make sense about the story. Look for the thing that you haven't yet tried that might, that might be an out. Look for the one possible way this could succeed, and maybe you got to go try that one. Like, those are things we can do, right? Those are things we can, in the face of a big change, in the face of a problem that's happening in our external world, we can look for, like, all right, well, what is my purpose still valid? Like, how do I feel about that? How do I, how does that motivate me to get moving? How do I not make it about me? And then what are the weaknesses in the thing that everybody says about, like, oh, we're all doomed because X, Y, and Z. All right, where's the weak point in that story? Or where is the piece of that I can use? Okay, great. I'm going to ride that wave. Right now, I'm gonna, great. The spaceship is spinning. Congratulations, spinning is the new plan. Right?
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to take advantage of that motion. I'm just going to synchronize to that, and then we'll try to move forward. Right. So those are all things those are all strategies that, again, analogies that we use in our head. I'm in one of those situations. Okay, how do I move forward from this crisis?
And those non-obvious solutions, because they're non-obvious, take time to develop. They take time to expose. They take diverse experiences to tease out oftentimes. And that's what we see here, right? We can have multiple scientists bashing their head against this problem for decades and not see a solution versus, I mean, Murph had the solution right in front of her the entire time and she couldn't see it. And oftentimes I think that we do see that in movies, things are too obvious, but that actually does happen a lot of the time in real life, right? Like the non-obvious solution was sitting in front of us the entire time. We just didn't see it because we were biased by our past experiences, just like AI gets biased by its past data that it's looking at. We just can't see this because it fits outside of our mental model for how that thing should operate currently. So to be able to get past it, it just requires diverse perspectives. It requires diverse experiences. It requires many, many, many iterations. And in the case of Murph, to not give up, never to give up on that just because she tried a million obvious and non-obvious solutions to no end.
Right. Well, and, if you zoom out far enough, it's obvious how all these learnings stack on each other, right? There are so many things that we understand about the universe and the world right now that we did not understand 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 500 years ago or 10,000 years ago, right? It's, if you zoom out far enough, like, oh, well, of course it's possible to learn something new. Of course it's possible to break through these things. Of course it's possible to split an atom and break this sound barrier and have a machine that plays chess, right? Right. So who knows what else is possible? You don't know what specific thing is out there, but all of those things are just layers and layers of new understanding in different directions. And so just keeping that in mind keeps you out of that constrained static mindset, right? Keeps you out of the scarcity mindset of, like, well, if people figured all these things out, then other things must still be available to learn, right? We are not at the end of human knowledge. We're never at the end of human knowledge.
That's great, Brian. Man, another Wonder Tour in the books. It's my pleasure to lead wisely with you here. Look forward to learning more next week.
Yes. So thanks, everyone, for joining us once again. This was episode 102 and our second pivot to video episode for this Lead Wisely initiative by WonderTour. We're really looking forward to our next couple of episodes where we'll be examining the same core question about how should humans leverage and interact with technology, and how should we think about that challenge as leaders. We're going to be exploring that through a couple other media properties as we go over the next couple episodes. So we really hope you'll join us for those. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Looking forward to seeing you then. And in the meantime, just remember, as always, character is destiny.